Did you hear about the incredibly powerful man who destroyed his own life trying to hide an affair? I know. It sounds like the kind of scandal that shows up in every newspaper and has everyone talking for a week. But this story manages to be even more absurd than that. Let me tell you. There was a massive operation happening outside the city for his company. Everyone was working, solving problems, doing exactly what they were supposed to be doing. And him? He stayed home. One afternoon, he decided to walk out onto the terrace of his penthouse. He looked over at the building next door and saw a woman. Beautiful, very beautiful. And that was enough. He called one of his employees and asked for one thing: find out who she is. A little while later, the answer came back. She was married, and she was not married to just anyone. She was married to one of the most loyal employees he had. You know, the kind of person every boss would want on the team? Always available, never complains, does what he promises. The kind of person who is truly all in. When he found that out, the story could have ended right there. He knew who she was. He knew she was married. He knew exactly how big of a problem he was creating. But there is something strange about very powerful people. Sometimes they start to believe certain rules exist for everyone, except them. So he sent for the woman. They spent that night together. The next morning she went back home. And for a few weeks, it looked like none of it had ever happened. Until a message arrived. Short, simple, but enough to destroy any plan. I'm pregnant. Now the problem was no longer just hiding an affair. There was proof, and he had to do something. That was when he came up with a plan that in his mind probably seemed perfect. He called the husband back from the operation. The excuse? He needed a report. He wanted to speak with him in person. But the report was never the point. The idea was to get the employee to go home, spend the night with his wife, and believe the baby was his. If it worked, no one would ever find out. Except something happened that he never imagined. The employee simply did not go home. He finished the meeting, left the building, and slept in the security booth with the guards. When they asked him why, his answer was basically this: my teammates are still out there risking their lives. How can I sleep in my own bed while they are still in the field? Imagine the panic. The perfect plan had just failed. So came plan B. He invited the employee to dinner, had drinks served, more drinks, and more drinks. The logic was simple. If his conscience would not let him go home, maybe the alcohol would. It didn't. Even drunk. He went back to sleep in the staff quarters for the second night in a row. And this is where the story changes completely. Because up until now, he was still trying to hide the mistake. From this point on, he starts creating new mistakes to hide the first one. The next morning, he wrote a confidential letter, folded the paper, sealed it, and handed it to the one person who should never have received it. The employee himself, without knowing it, he was carrying his own sentence in his hands. Inside the letter, there was an order. Put this man in the most dangerous part of the operation and, at the right moment, pull back. That is exactly what happened. The employee died. When the news arrived, the boss's reaction was almost cold. He said these things happen, that difficult operations always have losses, that no one should be discouraged because of it. Sometime later, when the mourning period was over, he did something that, from the outside, looked like a beautiful gesture. He took in the widow. He married her. He accepted the child too. To everyone watching from the outside, he looked generous, a leader taking care of a woman in a difficult moment. It almost looked like a love story. There was only one problem. No one knew what had really happened. But there is one detail I have kept from you until now. This story did not happen in a company. It was not printed in any newspaper. It was not the subject of some recent documentary. It was recorded almost 3,000 years ago. It is in 2 Samuel chapters 11 and 12. The powerful man was David, the woman was Bathsheba, and the employee, who unknowingly carried his own death sentence, was Uriah. Maybe you already knew those names, maybe not, but that is exactly the point. Most people think they know this story, but it is almost always remembered as a story about adultery, when, in reality, it is about something much bigger. Deep down, this story is not only about betrayal, it is about what happens when someone starts believing the rules still apply to everyone, except him. But there is something that really changes the way you look at this story. It does not begin when David sees Bathsheba. We usually think the first mistake was the moment he sent for her, but the text begins before that, and it makes a point of showing one detail. David was supposed to be where his men were, in the field, leading, taking part in the war, but he was in the palace, alone, at the top. The man who had once been known for standing among his people was now separated from them. And maybe that is the first thing that stands out in this story. Maybe the problem had already begun earlier, not with one huge decision, but with him getting used to making small exceptions for himself. The first layer, isolation. David was not a nobody. He was not someone without self-control. That is what makes everything more complicated. He had once been disciplined. He had faced danger. He had shown courage. And the higher he rose, the fewer people probably had the courage to challenge him. At some point, a person hears yes so often. They stop noticing when they have crossed a line, and when no one around them questions their choices, a powerful person can start confusing. Privilege with right, desire with permission. The second layer, power changes the way people see consequences. Think about it. An ordinary person could see someone attractive, feel desire, and move on with life. But David was not an ordinary person. He had resources, he had authority, he had people willing to obey. When he wanted to know who she was, someone found out. When he wanted her brought to him, someone brought her. When he wanted to hide the problem, someone carried out the plan. And that may be the most frightening part. The desire may have been his, but power put a whole group of people in motion to turn that desire into action. The third layer, Uriah is the most interesting character in the story. And maybe the greatest irony in this narrative is this. The man everyone might have expected to be the problem was not. Uriah had every reason to act differently. He was the betrayed husband. He had been deceived. He was being used. And still, when he came back home, he showed more loyalty than the very leader who commanded them all. He refused comfort. He refused an opportunity. He refused to think only of himself. And at that point, it becomes hard not to compare the two. David had position, authority, and people obeying him. Uriah had something David was no longer managing to have: control over himself. The fourth layer, the problem was never just hiding a mistake. That may be the most human part of this story. David could have stopped after the first choice, after the second, after the third. At several points, there was a way out, but every attempt to hide the problem created a bigger problem. It is a pattern that appears all the time. People do not destroy their lives only because of the mistakes they make. Many times, they destroy everything trying to make sure no one discovers those mistakes. The final question of the investigation, and maybe the most interesting part, is this. If David had known, at the beginning, everything that would happen afterward, would he have done it differently? Or did he believe so strongly in that moment that he could control everything, that he could not even imagine where that first choice would lead? One curious thing about this story is that for thousands of years, different people have looked at the same events and seen different layers. Across the centuries, many have read this story as a sequence. First comes desire, then the attempt to hide it, and before he realizes it, he is doing things he never would have imagined doing at the beginning. Another reading focuses less on the affair and more on what he does after it. There is also an important discussion about the difference between having power and having character. The disturbing thing is that he probably did not imagine where it would end when everything began. One of the most common interpretations of this passage is that the greatest danger is not only in the first mistake, it is in how someone responds after it. Because admitting failure requires something difficult, accepting that your own image has been broken. And for someone used to being admired, that can be even harder. David was seen as a great leader, someone who won battles, someone who inspired people. So there is a strong contrast in this story. He had won battles that seemed impossible, but in that situation, he could not set limits for himself. Another widely discussed point is the difference between power and character. In the narrative, David had everything we usually associate with success: position, respect, influence, authority. But none of those things stopped him from making destructive decisions. And this is an idea that appears often in interpretations of this story. Power does not make someone a better person. sometimes it only reveals what was already inside. In the Christian tradition, the next chapter is also essential to understanding the full meaning of the story. Because the episode does not end only with the discovery of the mistake. David is confronted by the prophet Nathan, but Nathan does not arrive by accusing him directly. He tells a story about a rich man who takes what belonged to a poor man, and when David reacts with anger against that man, Nathan reveals, that story was about you. This moment is considered one of the most important points in the narrative, because the confrontation does not happen through force, it happens through conscience. David is forced to look at his own actions without being able to hide behind title, position, or public image. Within the Christian tradition, David's repentance is also very important. Not because the consequences disappear, but because the story presents a different idea. A person can be responsible for what they did and still recognize their own failure. The famous Psalm 51 is traditionally associated with this moment, a text about guilt, recognition, and the desire to change. And maybe that is the most interesting part of this story. It does not present a perfect character, or a character who is simply evil. It presents a powerful person who made bad choices, and then had to face who he had become. And maybe that is exactly why this story keeps being told. Because it is very easy to look at monsters and say, I would never do that. But stories like this ask a much more uncomfortable question. What would an ordinary person do if they had enough power, no immediate consequences, and a chance to hide everything? The human pattern hidden in this story, maybe the most uncomfortable part of the story, is realizing that it did not begin with one grand decision. It did not begin with a plan. It did not begin with someone waking up and choosing to destroy another person. It began with something much smaller, a choice, a desire, a thought that could have been ignored. The most uncomfortable part is seeing how one thing pulled the next. First he wanted, then he tried to hide it. When the plan failed, he tried to control the people around him, and before long, he was no longer fixing a mistake. He was creating new ones to protect the first, and power made everything easier. Not because it turned David into a different person overnight, but because it gave him the means to do almost anything he wanted without hearing the word no. The fear of looking wrong can make someone make even worse decisions. The first choice creates a problem. The attempt to hide it creates another. Then the person has to hide the second problem. And suddenly, they are not trying to fix anything anymore. They are trying to stop people from discovering who they have become. And people with power rarely notice the exact moment when they begin to abuse it. Because abuse of power does not always look like someone saying, I am the villain. Most of the time, it looks like a sequence of justifications. I deserve this. I can fix this. No one needs to know. It will not hurt anyone. Until, by the time the person realizes it, they have already crossed several lines they once never imagined crossing. And maybe the most important contrast in this story is between David and Uriah, because the narrative places them side by side. One had position, the other had character. One had authority, the other had self-control. One could get almost anything he wanted. The other managed to do something far more difficult, control himself. And that raises what may be the most important question of all. What really defines a person? What they possess, the title they hold, the way people see them, or the choices they make when no one is watching? Because that is the strange detail in the story. David was not remembered only for his failures. Before this, he was remembered for courage, for leadership, for victories, and maybe that is what makes the story so human. People are rarely just one thing. Someone can be admired in one part of life and completely undone by choices in another. In the end, it was one choice pulling the next. Desire became a secret. The secret became fear, and fear became the need to control everyone around him. A cycle that appears in different places, times, and cultures. The names change, the settings change, but the path remains frighteningly familiar. And maybe that is the strangest part of this story. It happened thousands of years ago. There were no social media platforms, no cameras, no instant messages, no world where anyone could discover a secret in just a few minutes. And still, David's problem was not the lack of technology. It was something much older. It was the belief that enough power could control the consequences. Today, a story like this would probably be discovered in a different way. There would be records, messages, investigations, people trying to reconstruct what happened. A secret this big would have a much harder time staying hidden. But the most uncomfortable part is realizing that the behavior behind it still appears. Maybe today someone would not send a letter, putting another person in danger. Maybe there would be no battlefield. Today the setting would be different, but the impulse would be the same: to use influence to protect your own image and spend more energy hiding the mistake than trying to repair it. The difference between who we are when everyone is watching and who we are when we think no one is. David began this story as someone admired, a leader, a winner, someone who seemed to have control over everything. But the moment he believed he no longer needed to follow the same rules as everyone else, he began to lose the very thing that made him admired. Maybe the question this story leaves us with is not, how could someone so powerful do something like this? Maybe the question is, how often do ordinary people make similar choices, just on a smaller scale? It almost never looks like a tragedy at the beginning. It looks like an exception, a justification, something that, in that moment, feels easy to control. And thousands of years later, we are still here, reading the same story, asking the same questions, trying to understand the same behaviors. Technology has changed, governments have changed, cities have changed, names have changed. But some things remain the same. History doesn't repeat, people do.